22-year-old Karyn Kupcinet chased Hollywood stardom to escape her dark roots. She was a struggling actress who grew up sharing a dining table with Chicago Mafia boss Sam Giancana. Exactly 20 minutes before John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, a frantic woman called a California switchboard screaming a precise warning. 6 days later, Karyn was found with her throat professionally crushed. Police quickly dismissed her death as a tragic lover's quarrel. But a cleanly snapped neck bone is not a broken heart. It is the surgical signature of an outfit assassin. Karyn intercepted a lethal secret, and the men who killed a president ensured she was permanently silenced. The timeline reveals a chilling synchronization. On November 22nd, the president's motorcade was rolling through Dealey Plaza. The crowds were cheering. The sun was shining thousands of miles away in the quiet, coastal town of Oxnard, California. A telephone operator sat at a switchboard. It was a mundane Friday. The board lit up. The operator plugged into the line. The voice on the other end was pure terror. It was a woman. She was frantic. She was screaming into the receiver. The words tumbled out in a hysterical rush. The president is going to be killed. Pull down the window curtains. The president is going to die. The operator was stunned. The line crackled. The woman sounded desperate. She sounded like someone watching a train hurtle towards a broken bridge. Then the line went dead. The operator contacted the authorities. The police tried to trace the call. They were too slow. 20 minutes later, the bullets tore through the president's motorcade. The warning was real. It was precisely timed. It was completely ignored. Years later, some independent researchers pointed towards a terrifying, though highly contested, conclusion. They theorized the frantic voice from Oxnard belonged to Karyn Kupcinet. According to this theory, she had tried to blow the whistle, attempting to stop the assassination of the most powerful man in the world. If true, the moment she placed that call, she became a catastrophic liability. While official records never confirmed this link, proponents of the theory argue the Mafia's intelligence network was vast enough to monitor such leaks, stretching its influence from the blood-stained streets of Dallas all the way to the palm trees of Hollywood. In their view, an order was transmitted. A protocol was activated to silence the girl. Karyn did not arrive in Los Angeles as just another naive farm girl looking for stardust. She carried the heavy weight of the Kupcinet bloodline, an anchor to a Chicago world of absolute power and systemic corruption. In the mid-20th century, that name was a heavy crown. It was an anchor to a world of absolute power and absolute corruption. Her father was Kupcinet. He was not a mere journalist. He was an institution in Chicago. He wrote a syndicated newspaper column that dictated the social and political reality of the city. He could make a career with a single sentence. He could destroy a reputation with a single omission. Kupcinet did not just report the news, he orchestrated it. He operated in a city where the lines between law enforcement, politics, and organized crime were completely erased. Drank whiskey with senators. He broke bread with police chiefs. Crucially, he dined with mob bosses. He was intimately acquainted with Sam Giancana. Giancana was the ruthless, terrifying head of the Chicago outfit. He was a man who ordered murders as casually as ordering a steak. Kupcinet also knew a local hustler and nightclub owner named Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby was a mob associate. He was a violent man with a short temper. This was the same Jack Ruby who would soon step out of a crowd in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters and shoot Lee Harvey Oswald in the stomach on live national television. Karyn grew up in this shadow. Her childhood was not ordinary. The Kupcinet household was a crossroads for the elite and the dangerous. She sat at dinner tables where secrets were traded like poker chips. She listened to conversations that altered the course of municipal elections. She breathed air thick with cigar smoke and unspoken threats. She understood early on that power was not held by the men giving speeches on television. Power was held by the men sitting in the back booths of dimly lit steakhouses. Blood was simply the cost of doing business. Karyn wanted out. She craved escape. She looked at the flashing lights of Hollywood and saw salvation. She wanted to build an identity entirely separate from her father's empire. She wanted to be an artist. She packed her bags and moved to California. She threw herself into acting classes. She went to auditions. She tried to blend in with the thousands of other beautiful, desperate young women chasing the silver screen. But Hollywood is a city built on illusions, and Karyn's greatest illusion was thinking she could outrun her name. The studios gave her minor roles. They cast her in bit parts in television shows. She worked hard. She tried to prove her worth on camera. But the industry did not see Karyn the artist. They saw Karyn the daughter of Kupcinet. They hired her to curry favor with her father. Her talent was secondary to her leverage. She managed to secure fleeting appearances on popular programs like The Andy Griffith Show and The Hawaiian Eye, playing wholesome characters that sharply contrasted with the cynical reality she knew. Yet these minor victories felt hollow when the cameras stopped rolling. Directors often treated her with a polite but dismissive distance, fully aware that casting the Kupcinet heir was a political maneuver rather than a purely creative choice. She found herself trapped in a gilded cage, desperately studying method acting, while studio executives merely analyzed her family tree and assessed her father's influence. The internal conflict tore at her. Inside, she was a sensitive soul, desperate for artistic validation. She wanted to be loved for her craft. Outside, she was treated as a strategic asset. She was a pawn on a chessboard she desperately wanted to leave. She navigated the shallow cocktail parties of Beverly Hills, smiling for the cameras, while her mind replayed the dark, cynical lessons she had learned in Chicago. She could read the fake smiles of the studio executives. She recognized the predatory glint in the eyes of the producers. It was the same glint she had seen in the eyes of her father's associates back home. The tragedy of Karyn Kupcinet is the tragedy of a misplaced variable. She was never meant to be a primary target. The Chicago outfit did not care about a young actress in California, but the outfit cared about survival. In the early 1960s, the mob was fighting a war on multiple fronts. They had helped deliver the crucial state of Illinois for John F. Kennedy during the 1960 election. They used their union influence, their street muscle, and their deep pockets to secure his victory. They expected gratitude. They expected immunity. Instead, they got betrayal. The president appointed his brother Robert F. Kennedy as Attorney General. Robert Kennedy launched a relentless, merciless crusade against organized crime. He subpoenaed the bosses. He wiretapped their phones. He dragged Sam Giancana into the spotlight. The mob felt cheated. They felt cornered. Men like Giancana did not accept betrayal. They answered it with violence. They designed a complex, multi-layered conspiracy to assassinate the president. It was a plot that required absolute secrecy. Karyn Kupcinet fell into the crosshairs of this conspiracy through sheer proximity. Her father's deep ties to the Chicago underworld created a conduit of information. Whispers traveled fast in those circles, loose lips at a cocktail party, a careless phone call, a drunken boast from a mob associate. Somehow the details of the Dallas plot reached Karyn. She became a liability, a collateral variable. The outfit operated on a simple principle. Anyone who knew too much had to be eliminated. It did not matter that she was Kupcinet's daughter. It did not matter that she was a young woman trying to make movies. She possessed a radioactive secret. The moment she picked up the telephone to call the Oxnard operator, the final tumbler clicked into place. She transformed from a Hollywood hopeful into a security threat. The days following the assassination were chaotic. The nation was in a state of collective trauma. Lee Harvey Oswald was in custody. Then Jack Ruby silenced Oswald. The narrative was spinning out of control. The men in Chicago needed to ensure that no further leaks occurred. The cleanup operation commenced. Karyn sat in her West Hollywood apartment. The walls must have felt like they were closing in. She watched the news coverage. She saw Jack Ruby, a man her father knew, gun down the accused assassin. She knew exactly what was happening. She knew the official story was a fabrication. The psychological weight of that knowledge must have been crushing. She was isolated. She could not call the police. The police were compromised. She could not call her father. Her father was part of the ecosystem that had orchestrated the hit. Isolated in her waking nightmare, the contrast was absolute. While the California sun beat down on palm trees and studio lots bustled with sitcom productions, inside her apartment, Karyn was paralyzed. Every knock at the door, every ring of the telephone or creak of the floorboards sent a jolt of panic through her nervous system. Her erratic behavior and the strange notes she left behind were noticed by friends. But in typical Hollywood fashion, they brushed it off as career depression or heartbreak over a minor actor. Visitors to her apartment in those final days recalled it being unnervingly dark in the middle of the afternoon, the heavy blinds drawn tight against the bright California glare. She had begun leaving cryptic, rambling notes scattered across her coffee table, documenting a growing, suffocating terror that she could not safely vocalize to anyone. Furthermore, friends noted she constantly checked the locks and peered through the peephole at the slightest sound in the hallway. It was the highly specific behavior of a woman meticulously mapping her own impending doom, waiting for an enemy she could not outrun. They applied the shallow logic of Hollywood to a situation that was steeped in the blood of international espionage. They could not fathom the reality. They could not comprehend that the girl next door was waiting for a hit squad. She tried to maintain a facade. She attended dinners. She forced smiles. But her eyes betrayed a deep, hollow fear. She was a ghost, walking among the living. She knew the rules of the world she grew up in. The outfit did not forgive. The outfit did not forget. They were coming for her. It was not a matter of if, it was a matter of when. The silence of her apartment became oppressive. The television provided a constant stream of white noise. The news anchors repeated the same approved lies about a lone gunman. Karyn knew the truth. She knew the gunman was a patsy. She knew the real killers were smoking cigars in Chicago boardrooms, watching the very same broadcasts, satisfied with their work. She was the last loose thread. The machinery of the mob moves with terrifying administrative efficiency rather than blind anger. Once a target is identified and a contract is issued, a dispatch specialist leaves no fingerprints or witnesses. Instead, they carefully construct a narrative designed to satisfy the authorities, ensuring the ultimate goal is not merely murder, but total obfuscation. As November drew to a close, the cold reality of her situation settled in. Karyn Kupcinet was a prisoner in the City of Angels. She had run across the country to escape her bloodline, only to find that the bloodline had followed her. The shadow of Chicago stretched all the way to the Pacific coast. The men who controlled her father now controlled her fate. She had spoken out of turn. She had tried to save a president. Now there was no one left to save her. The geography of West Hollywood in November 1963 was a landscape of ambition and delusion. Apartment buildings with courtyard pools housed thousands of young men and women waiting for a phone call that would change their lives. Karyn Kupcinet lived at 1222 North Sweetser Avenue. It was a standard California complex, stucco walls, tiled roofs, a place designed for sunshine and easy living. But for Karyn, the apartment had become a tomb long before her heart stopped beating. The week following the assassination of John F. Kennedy was a period of national mourning. Families gathered around television sets. The country wept. Thanksgiving arrived on November 28th. It was a holiday meant for gratitude and homecoming. Karyn did not go home to Chicago. She could not face the city that had birthed her nightmare. She remained in Los Angeles. She isolated herself. She locked the doors. She drew the curtains. The bright Southern California sunlight was locked out, replaced by the artificial glow of lamps and the flickering screen of her television set. Her internal reality was a state of permanent, vibrating panic. She had made the call from Oxnard. She knew the assassination was a coordinated strike. She saw Jack Ruby, a man her father knew intimately, execute the accused assassin on live television. The circle was closing. The men who orchestrated the death of a president were now tying up the loose ends. Karyn was a loose end. She sat in her apartment, a 22-year-old girl holding a secret that possessed the explosive force of a nuclear weapon. She knew the Chicago outfit did not leave witnesses. She knew her father's power could not protect her. Her father was part of the very machinery that was hunting her. She took prescription pills to calm her nerves. They did not work. The chemical sedation only made her movements sluggish while her mind raced. She jumped at the sound of a passing car. She stared at the telephone, terrified it would ring, terrified it would remain silent. She was entirely cut off from the world. She was drowning in plain sight. Her friends in the acting community noticed her erratic behavior. They attributed it to weight loss pills or the stress of a stalled career. They lived in a shallow world of auditions and headshots. They lacked the vocabulary to understand the terror of a mob contract. They left her alone. They thought she just needed rest. The killer did not arrive with a battering ram. Professionals do not kick down doors. They do not shatter glass. Noise is the enemy of a clean operation. The assassin approached the apartment on North Sweetser Avenue with the calm detachment of a technician going to work. The Los Angeles night was cool. The courtyard was quiet. The killer reached the door. There was no forced entry. The lock was bypassed with either a master key or the swift, practiced movements of an elite lockpicker. The metal tumblers clicked softly. The door swung open. Karyn was inside. The television was on. The volume was suddenly turned up to the maximum level. The blaring sound of the broadcast filled the room, rattling the cheap windows. It was a tactical maneuver. The deafening noise was designed to mask any sound of a struggle. It ensured that the neighbors would not hear a scream, a gasp, or the thud of a body hitting the floor. The television screamed so Karyn could not. The execution was brutal, efficient, and horrifyingly fast. The killer did not use a weapon that could be traced. There was no gun. There was no knife. The weapon was a pair of hands trained in the anatomy of death. Karyn was grabbed. She was overpowered instantly. The killer applied crushing pressure to her neck. This was not a crime of passion. When a jealous lover or an angry acquaintance strangles someone, the act is messy. It involves a prolonged struggle. The victim fights back, skin is scratched, furniture is overturned. The pressure applied is often uneven, driven by blind rage rather than technique. The murder of Karyn Kupcinet bore the undeniable signature of a contract hit. The key piece of forensic evidence lay in a small U-shaped bone in the human neck, the hyoid bone. Heavily protected at the root of the tongue, it does not break easily. Fracturing it typically requires a massive, targeted application of manual force. When the autopsy was later performed, the coroner found that Karyn's hyoid bone had been snapped completely in half. It was a brutal clinical termination of life that collapsed her airway in seconds. Karyn had no chance to fight. She was a small woman, weakened by stress and medication. She was subdued and killed with terrifying clinical precision. The life was squeezed out of her while the television blared meaningless noise into the small apartment. The secret she carried died in her throat. Once the target was eliminated, the second phase of the operation began. Murder is only half the job. The other half is misdirection. The killer needed to ensure that the Los Angeles Police Department would look at the scene and draw the wrong conclusions. A mob hit draws federal attention. A Hollywood tragedy draws tabloid gossip. The killer chose the latter. The body was stripped naked. It was positioned on the sofa. The arrangement was deliberate. It was designed to look degrading. It was designed to look like a sexual assault or the violent aftermath of a lover's quarrel. The killer arranged the room to suggest chaos, but a careful, controlled chaos. The scene was dressed like a movie set. The objective was to hand the detectives a narrative they were already primed to believe. Young actress, naked body, locked apartment. The police would automatically assume it was a domestic dispute or a predatory casting director. They would chase phantom lovers. They would dig into her dating history. They would look everywhere except Chicago. The assassin finished the staging. The killer checked the room for physical evidence. There were no fingerprints. There were no dropped matchbooks. There was nothing. The killer walked out the front door, pulling it shut. The lock clicked back into place. The killer walked down the stairs out of the courtyard and vanished into the Los Angeles night. The operation was flawless. The threat was neutralized. The Chicago outfit had protected its investment in the Dallas conspiracy. Inside the apartment, Karyn Kupcinet lay dead on the sofa. The television continued to roar. It played commercials. It played sitcoms. It played endless news loops about the grieving Kennedy family, and the dead assassin Lee Harvey Oswald. The noise pounded against the walls of the small room, a relentless soundtrack to a silent corpse. The television stayed on for days. The neighbors heard the noise. They thought it was strange. They knocked on the walls. They complained about the volume. But in a city of strangers, nobody intervened. People minded their own business. They assumed she was deaf or drunk or simply rude. They did not assume she was dead. Thanksgiving passed. The weekend arrived. The apartment remained a sealed tomb of blaring noise and decaying flesh. On Saturday, November 30th, the isolation was finally broken. Two of Karyn's friends, actor Mark Goddard and his wife Marcia, became worried. Karyn had not answered her telephone for days. She had missed a planned dinner. They drove to North Sweetser Avenue. They walked up to her door. They could hear the television screaming from inside. They knocked. There was no answer. They banged on the wood. Nothing. A sense of dread settled over them. They found the building manager. They convinced him to open the door with his master key. The manager turned the lock. The door swung open. The blast of the television hit them first, followed immediately by the sweet, sickening smell of death. They stepped into the apartment. They saw the sofa. They saw Karyn. Marcia screamed. Mark Goddard stood paralyzed. The sight defied comprehension. Their friend was dead, naked, and staged in a grotesque tableau. The television was practically vibrating with volume. The disconnect between the mundane living room setting and the absolute horror of the corpse was violently jarring. The manager ran to call the police. The friends stood in the doorway, staring at a crime scene they could not decode. They thought they were looking at a Hollywood murder. They did not know they were looking at the final casualty of the Kennedy assassination. The Los Angeles Police Department arrived quickly. Uniformed officers secured the building. Detectives in cheap suits walked into the apartment. They turned off the television. The sudden silence in the room was heavier than the noise had been. The detectives looked at the body. They looked at the locked door. They took out their notepads. The trap set by the killer snapped shut perfectly on the minds of the LAPD. The detectives surveyed the naked body and immediately fell for the misdirection. They started asking questions about her boyfriends. They asked about her recent breakups. They looked for signs of a sexual assault. They cataloged the prescription pills in her bathroom cabinet. They viewed Karyn Kupcinet through the lens of a cynical police department dealing with another dead girl in a town full of them. They did not look at her father's connections. They did not look at the Oxnard phone call. They did not connect the dots between a dead actress in West Hollywood and a dead president in Dallas. The systemic failure of the investigation began in the very first hour. The detectives treated it as a localized, isolated incident. They were dealing with a transnational intelligence operation, but they investigated it like a bar fight. The coroner arrived. The body was bagged and removed. The apartment was sealed. The news broke the next day. The headlines splashed across the country. Daughter of prominent Chicago columnist found dead in Hollywood. The media ran with the salacious details. Naked, locked room mystery. The newspapers spun tales of Hollywood decadence and broken dreams. The narrative was cemented. Karyn Kupcinet was written off as a tragic casualty of the entertainment industry. The Chicago outfit watched the news coverage with satisfaction. The plan had worked. The police were chasing their tails. The media was printing garbage. The secret was buried with the girl. The men in tailored suits continued their business. They counted their money. They ordered their steaks. They knew the fundamental rule of power in America. Truth is not what happens. Truth is what the police can prove, and the police could prove absolutely nothing. The investigation immediately stalled. The detectives interviewed actors. They interviewed agents. They interviewed the ex-boyfriend, a minor television actor named Andrew Prine. They subjected him to intense scrutiny. They searched his home. They looked for a motive. They found nothing but the messy remnants of a failed relationship. Prine was cleared, but the police kept circling back to the same tired theories. They could not accept that the killer was a ghost. They could not accept that the motive originated 2,000 miles away. The physical evidence offered no salvation. The fingerprints in the apartment belonged to Karyn and her known friends. The autopsy confirmed death by strangulation and the snapped hyoid bone. It also confirmed that there was no sexual assault. The staging of the naked body was a pure theatrical prop. But even with this medical contradiction, the police refused to widen their scope. They refused to look at the professional nature of the kill. They were blind men feeling the leg of an elephant, convinced they were holding a tree trunk. The greatest obstacle to the truth was not the LAPD's incompetence. It was the terrifying silence of Karyn Kupcinet. When a powerful man loses a child to murder, the standard response is fury. A man with a syndicated newspaper column, television shows, and political leverage uses his arsenal to demand justice. He puts pressure on the police chief. He calls the mayor. He uses his front page space to keep the investigation alive. When a powerful man loses a child to murder, the public expects a relentless crusade. Karyn Kupcinet arrived in Los Angeles, a broken father, to claim his daughter's body. Initially, he and his wife offered a substantial $10,000 reward for information leading to her killer. However, as the investigation stalled and the media circus intensified, his public posture shifted. He asked the press to respect his privacy. Crucially, when independent researchers later began circulating theories connecting Karyn's death to his own underworld contacts and the JFK assassination, Irv aggressively shot them down. He publicly dismissed the theories as garbage, insisting until his dying day that his daughter's death was a random, senseless tragedy. His behavior defies parental logic, but it perfectly aligns with the logic of a hostage. Karyn Kupcinet knew the men who ran Chicago. He knew Sam Giancana. He knew that Giancana had ordered the hit on his daughter. The murder of Karyn was not just a silencing operation. It was a message to Irv. It was a demonstration of absolute power. The mob was telling the media titan, "We can reach your blood. We can kill your child in a locked room across the country, and there is nothing you can do about it." Irv was presented with a brutal choice. He could declare war on the Chicago outfit. He could use his newspaper to expose the Dallas conspiracy and his daughter's role in it. If he did that, he would be a dead man. His wife would be a dead woman. The outfit would slaughter his remaining family. Or he could accept the narrative. He could swallow his agony. He could pretend his daughter was killed by a random burglar. He could protect his life and his empire by protecting the men who murdered his child. He chose silence. He chose survival. He became an active participant in the cover-up of his own daughter's murder. The psychological torment of that decision must have been unimaginable. He had to look in the mirror every day, knowing the killers were free, knowing he shook hands with the men who ordered the snapped hyoid bone. Kupcinet traded justice for breath. His silence guaranteed that the LAPD cold case files would never thaw. It guaranteed that the ghost of Karyn Kupcinet would wander the archives of unsolved mysteries forever. The Los Angeles County Morgue was a sanctuary of absolute, unfeeling truth. It was a place constructed of stainless steel, white tiles, and fluorescent lights that buzzed with a low mechanical hum. Detectives could lie. Politicians could lie. The media could fabricate entire realities before breakfast. But the dead did not lie. On the autopsy table, stripped of the glamorous facade of Hollywood and the heavy burden of the Kupcinet name, Karyn was simply a subject of biological forensic analysis. The coroner stood over her body. He held a scalpel. He was a man trained to read the final violent chapters of human lives. He looked at the bruised tissue around her throat. He made his incisions. He peeled back the layers of skin and muscle. He found the hyoid bone. It was shattered. The medical examiner documented the fracture. He noted the precise amount of force required to snap that specific piece of human anatomy. It was a detail that should have redirected the entire trajectory of the Los Angeles Police Department investigation. A broken hyoid bone is a loud, ringing alarm bell in a homicide case. It speaks of overwhelming, concentrated power. It speaks of a killer who knows exactly how to terminate a human life in a matter of seconds. It does not fit the profile of a panicked boyfriend lashing out in the heat of a chaotic argument. It fits the profile of a professional executioner. The coroner finalized his report. He handed the medical facts to the detectives. The detectives took the paperwork. They placed it in a manila folder. They completely ignored its implications. The investigative apparatus of the LAPD in 1963 was a deeply political machine. It was designed to protect the image of the city as much as it was designed to solve crimes. A dead actress in West Hollywood was a public relations problem. The police brass wanted a quick resolution. They wanted a neat narrative. They wanted a jealous lover in handcuffs so they could close the file and move on to the next body. They did not want to uncover a transnational assassination ring ordered by the Chicago Mafia. They did not want to look into telephone switchboards in Oxnard or dead presidents in Dallas. They focused their crosshairs entirely on Andrew Prine. He was Karyn's former boyfriend. He was an actor. He was accessible. He was the perfect scapegoat for a department desperate to avoid a federal nightmare. They brought him into the interrogation room. The room was small. The air was stale with cigarette smoke and stale coffee. They sat him under the harsh lights. They grilled him for hours. They asked him about their arguments. They asked him about his whereabouts. They pushed him, hoping he would break, hoping he would confess to a crime of passion. Andrew Prine had no confession to give. He had an alibi. He had a timeline that checked out. Furthermore, he lacked the physical capability and the psychological profile of a cold-blooded assassin who could snap a hyoid bone and stage a crime scene without leaving a single trace of forensic evidence. The detectives pounded the table. They raised their voices, but they were trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. They wanted a domestic dispute. They were dealing with a mob hit. Eventually, they had to let him go. They had nothing. No fingerprints. No murder weapon, No confession. The investigation hit a solid brick wall. This was the exact moment the systemic cover-up solidified. When a police department exhausts its initial flawed theory, it has two choices. It can step back, reevaluate the evidence, and follow the facts wherever they lead, no matter how dangerous or politically sensitive those facts might be. Or it can stop digging. The LAPD chose to stop digging. The order did not come down as a dramatic movie-style conspiracy with men meeting in dark parking garages. Systemic cover-ups are much more banal. They happen through bureaucratic inertia. They happen through subtle discouragement. Detectives who suggested looking into Kupcinet's Chicago connections were quietly told to focus their energy elsewhere. Leads that pointed outside the borders of California were deemed out of jurisdiction. The case file was starved of resources. It was placed on a lower priority list. It was slowly, methodically buried under a mountain of fresh homicides. The media played a crucial, devastating role in this burial. Newspapers across the country took their cues from the police and from the silence of Kupcinet. They needed a story to sell papers. If they could not sell a solved murder, they would sell a scandalous lifestyle. The press assassinated Karyn Kupcinet's character long after the hitman assassinated her body. They painted her as a troubled young woman. They focused on the diet pills found in her bathroom. They interviewed fringe acquaintances who called her unstable. They spun a narrative of a fragile, desperate actress who fell in with the wrong crowd and met a tragic, inevitable end. They turned a targeted political execution into a cautionary tale about the dark side of Hollywood ambition. It was victim blaming on a national scale. It was a comfortable lie that the American public eagerly consumed. Kupcinet read these newspapers. He read the articles that dragged his daughter's name through the mud. He sat in his office in Chicago, a man of immense power, and he let it happen. Through his widely syndicated column in the Chicago Sun-Times and his popular television talk show, Irv held the undivided attention of the American public. He regularly interviewed sitting presidents, global dignitaries, and cultural icons, commanding a massive media platform that could easily launch a federal inquiry overnight. His published words had previously dismantled corrupt local politicians, altered city legislation, and directed the moral compass of his readership. Yet when confronted with the brutal, targeted execution of his own flesh and blood, his formidable typewriter remained paralyzingly silent. He wrote his own syndicated column every day. He had the power to reach millions of readers. He could have written an editorial that tore the LAPD apart. He could have demanded the FBI take over the case. He could have defended Karyn's honor and forced the country to look at the Chicago outfit. He wrote about celebrities. He wrote about sports. He wrote about local politics. He never wrote about the broken hyoid bone. His purgatory must have been absolute. He wore tailored suits. He attended gala dinners. He flashed a smile made of glass for the cameras. But internally, he was a hostage. He was a man who knew the name of the beast that devoured his child, but he had to feed that same beast every single day to stay alive. Sam Giancana and the Chicago outfit did not send threatening letters. They did not leave voicemails. They operated on the terrifying assumption that men like Kupcinet already understood the rules. The rule was simple: you do not speak against the family. If you speak, you bleed. Kupcinet chose not to bleed. He chose to let the media label his daughter a tragic Hollywood failure. He sacrificed her legacy to protect his own survival. The chilling effect of this silence washed over the Hollywood community like a winter fog. Karyn's friends and acquaintances felt the temperature drop. They knew something was profoundly wrong. They had seen her terror in the days leading up to her death. Mark Goddard, the man who found her naked, decomposing body, was deeply traumatized. The image of the blaring television and the staged corpse was burned into his retinas. He knew Karyn. He knew she did not live like that. He knew she did not die like that. But nobody went to the federal authorities. Nobody called the FBI to report her frantic behavior or her deep fear of her family's connections. Hollywood is a town built on self-preservation. Actors, directors, and producers operate on a strict hierarchy of leverage. They sensed that the Kupcinet murder involved forces vastly more powerful than studio heads. They smelled the mob. When the mob is involved, witnesses develop amnesia. Friends stop returning phone calls. People look at the ground and keep walking. The fear was contagious, and it ensured that the LAPD faced a wall of silence not just from Chicago, but from Beverly Hills. While the LAPD chased its own tail and Karyn's friends kept their mouths shut, the broader national tragedy reached its grotesque conclusion. It was a weekend of blood and television. Lee Harvey Oswald sat in police custody in Dallas. He was the designated villain. He was the man the public was told to hate. But Oswald was a liability. He was a man who knew he was a patsy. He had said it himself to the reporters. If Oswald made it to trial, he would talk. He would expose the intelligence failures, the mob connections, the vast shadowy machinery that had placed him in that book depository. The men who orchestrated the strike on the president could not allow a trial to happen. They needed a closer. They needed someone desperate, violent, and deeply embedded in their network. They found Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby was a fixture in the Dallas underworld, but his roots trace straight back to the Chicago outfit. He was a nightclub owner who ran errands for the mob. He was a man who craved respect from the heavyweights. Crucially, he was a man Karyn Kupcinet knew. The degrees of separation between the dead actress in California and the dead president in Texas were shrinking rapidly. The nation watched live on television as Jack Ruby stepped out of a crowd of reporters in the basement of the Dallas police headquarters. He shoved a snub-nosed revolver into Lee Harvey Oswald's stomach and pulled the trigger. Oswald collapsed. He died shortly after. The television networks played the footage over and over again. It was the first live murder broadcast to millions of American homes. The public was shocked. The news anchors expressed disbelief. But in the smoky back rooms of Chicago, the men in fedoras breathed a sigh of relief. The loop was closed. The primary asset was eliminated. The fall guy was dead. Karyn Kupcinet was already dead. The timeline was a masterpiece of lethal logistics. The mob tied off the Dallas loose end with a bullet on live national television. They tied off the Hollywood loose end with a snapped neck in a quiet, locked room. The contrast in execution methods was stark, but the objective was identical. Silence. The assassination of Lee Harvey Oswald provided the ultimate distraction. The media frenzy shifted entirely to Jack Ruby. The Warren Commission was hastily assembled to investigate the president's death. They were given a mandate to find a lone gunman. They were not given a mandate to look into the Chicago Mafia, the Oxnard phone call, or the dead daughter of a powerful columnist. The sheer gravitational pull of the Dallas tragedy sucked all the oxygen out of the news cycle. Karyn Kupcinet's murder was swept off the front pages. It was relegated to the back sections, a minor curiosity overshadowed by a global trauma. The timing was the killer's greatest ally. If Karyn had been murdered 6 months earlier or 6 months later, her father's status might have forced a genuine investigation. The anomalies of the autopsy would have been scrutinized, but occurring precisely in the shadow of the Kennedy assassination, her death was perfectly camouflaged. The Chicago outfit understood the mechanics of news cycles better than the journalists themselves. They knew that a burning building distracts from a quiet strangulation in the alleyway next door. Inside the LAPD headquarters, the Karyn Kupcinet file grew thinner. Detectives moved on to fresh cases. New murders required fresh ink. The physical evidence collected from the apartment was placed into a cardboard box. The photographs of the crime scene, the coroner's report detailing the broken hyoid bone, the notes from the fruitless interrogation of Andrew Prine, all of it went into the box. The box was carried down to the archives. It was placed on a metal shelf in a vast climate-controlled room filled with thousands of other boxes. The fluorescent lights flickered. The dust began to settle. The perfect crime is rarely a crime with no evidence. The perfect crime is a crime where the evidence is deliberately ignored. The LAPD had the medical proof of a professional hit. They had the geographical anomaly of a Chicago media scion murdered in California without a local motive. They had the timeline aligning perfectly with the most significant political assassination of the century. They had all the pieces of the puzzle. They simply refused to put them together. The cardboard box sat on the shelf. The years turned into decades. The 1960s bled into the 1970s. The culture changed. The Vietnam War raged. The Watergate scandal broke. The country lost its innocence over and over again. The names of the detectives on the case faded. Sam Giancana was eventually murdered in his own basement, shot in the back of the head while frying sausages. A victim of the very violence he championed. Irv Kupcinet grew old. He continued to write his column. He continued to smile for the cameras. He carried his terrible secret until his dying breath, never breaking the code of silence that had cost him his child. Karyn Kupcinet remained frozen in time. She was forever 22 years old. She was forever trapped on that sofa, the television blaring, her voice silenced. The world forgot about the Oxnard phone call. The world forgot about the terrified actress who tried to warn the president. The archives of the Los Angeles Police Department became her final resting place. A cold case, an unsolved mystery, a minor footnote in a book written by powerful men. Ultimately, Karyn Kupcinet stepped into a deadly intersection of power and secrecy. Whether she was silenced by a transnational syndicate or fell victim to a devastating local tragedy, the machinery of the era simply crushed her memory and kept moving. The city of Los Angeles possesses a unique capacity for amnesia. It is a metropolis built entirely on the production of fresh narratives, relentlessly paving over its own dark history. The apartment on North Sweetser Avenue was eventually cleared. The crime scene tape was removed. The landlord painted the walls and new tenants moved their furniture into the exact space where a 22-year-old woman had her hyoid bone snapped in half. They sat in the living room, completely unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded within those walls. The California sun continued to beat down on the stucco exterior, and the palm trees continued to sway. The entertainment machine required new faces, and the industry simply marched forward, leaving the ghost of Karyn Kupcinet to linger in the dusty, unsolved archives of the LAPD. The decade shifted rapidly. The year 1964 arrived, bringing with it the Warren Commission report. It was a massive, heavy volume of paper generated by the government. Its sole purpose was to pacify a traumatized public. The report established the official doctrine of the era. Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Jack Ruby acted alone. There was no conspiracy. There was no systemic failure. The neat, sanitized version of history became the enforced truth. Anyone who questioned the findings was immediately branded a lunatic or a subversive. The government demanded closure. The press happily complied. Karyn's broken hyoid bone did not fit into the Warren Commission's neat narrative. Therefore, her broken hyoid bone was completely ignored. The men who orchestrated the strike on the president and the subsequent cleanup operation faced their own violent reckonings, but never for the murder of the young actress. Sam Giancana was eventually deposed from his throne in Chicago. He fled the country. He lived in exile in Mexico before being deported back to the United States. In the summer of 1975, the political climate had shifted. The United States Senate formed the Church Committee to investigate illegal intelligence gathering. They wanted to question Giancana about the deep, illegal collusion between the American intelligence apparatus and the Mafia. Giancana never made it to the hearing. He was shot in the back of the head while frying sausages in the basement kitchen of his Illinois home. The men who live by the sword die by the sword. But Giancana's violent end did not bring justice to Karyn Kupcinet. It merely closed another door. It silenced another critical witness. The chain of command that transmitted the kill order from Chicago to West Hollywood was systematically eradicated over the following decades. Mobsters were gunned down in drive-by shootings. Hitmen died in federal prisons. The physical links to the crime evaporated. Dead men do not confess, and the Chicago outfit made sure the men who knew the truth were all dead. For Karyn Kupcinet, who lived another 40 years as a celebrated Chicago media icon, the secret of the Oxnard call went to his grave in 2003, a final desperate act of survival. The Los Angeles Police Department never officially closed the Karyn Kupcinet file. A cold case never truly closes, it simply rots in place. The physical evidence collected from the apartment slowly degraded in storage. The potential witnesses passed away or forgot the details. The original detectives who walked into that blaring apartment retired, took their pensions, and faded away. The cold case unit occasionally pulled the file for a routine review, but it was a completely futile exercise. They lacked the political will, and more importantly, they lacked the jurisdiction to solve it. A local police department is an organ of the state. It is designed to solve local burglaries and domestic homicides. It is not designed to investigate the state itself. It is not equipped to dismantle the very power structures that fund its existence. Investigating the murder of Karyn Kupcinet meant investigating the systemic corruption that permanently linked the Chicago outfit, the intelligence community, and the assassination of a sitting president. No local detective was ever going to touch that highly radioactive wire. It was career suicide. The truth was too big for a local precinct to handle, so they handled nothing at all. Hollywood continued to manufacture illusions and sell them to a willing public. The film industry thrives on the specific myth of the tragic starlet. It romanticizes early death. It turns young, beautiful victims into enduring cultural icons. But Karyn Kupcinet was never afforded that grim luxury. She was not romanticized. She was completely erased. Her name was efficiently scrubbed from the collective memory of the entertainment industry. In the immediate aftermath of the police discovering her body, studio publicists quietly went to work, ensuring that Karyn's image was decoupled from any prestigious upcoming television projects. Mentioning her in industry trade publications became an unspoken taboo, a fast track to being blacklisted by producers who preferred their financial investments untainted by whispers of organized crime. Documents and headshots were silently removed from casting agency files, treating her mere existence as a liability. She was systematically demoted from a promising young talent to a nameless industry ghost story in a matter of mere weeks. The major studios did not want to be reminded of the blood that soaked their foundations. They did not want to publicly acknowledge that the glittering glamour of the red carpet was entirely reliant on the brutal enforcement tactics of the underworld. The men who ran the studios drank the same whiskey as the men who ran the mob. They understood the hierarchy of violence perfectly. Karyn was a casualty of that rigid hierarchy. Acknowledging her true fate meant acknowledging their own complicity in a corrupt system. They chose collective amnesia. The story of Karyn Kupcinet forces a harsh, uncompromising reevaluation of American history in the 20th century. The public is conditioned to believe in a linear progression of justice. Citizens are taught from a young age that crimes are eventually solved, villains are suitably punished, and the truth inevitably comes to light. The horrific events of November 1963 completely shatter that comforting, naive narrative. They reveal a barren landscape where true power operates with absolute, terrifying impunity. The assassination in Dallas was a loud public execution designed to instantly change the political direction of the most powerful country on earth. The murder in West Hollywood was a quiet, private execution designed to protect the architects of that massive political change. They were two sides of the same bloody transactional coin. One changed history books. The other was relegated to a forgotten police file. Karyn Kupcinet did not die because she lacked acting talent. She did not die because she entangled herself with a jealous lover. She died because she existed in a specific geographical and genealogical coordinate where the ultimate power brokers of the era violently collided. Hollywood in the 1960s was not a dream factory. It was a blood chessboard. It was a ruthless marketplace where the Mafia and the political elite traded favors, consolidated power, and settled their debts using human lives as currency. At the fragile age of 22, Karyn discovered a secret that possessed the raw power to topple the American government. She picked up a telephone and tried to issue a desperate warning to a deaf world. The Chicago Mafia delivered their swift, brutal response. They proved that in the cold, unforgiving arithmetic of power, the final warning is always paid for with permanent, absolute silence.